suonano loro. Andiamo a prendere il caffè.
Buongiorno, diamo inizio a questa sezione.
Good morning. Let's start this morning session dedicated to the forms of the arts. I would like just to inform you that this morning session should end by 12:15 in order to allow the graduation ceremony for the winners of the scholarships. Once again, this is why the debates, the discussions should, end by 12:15. We will please ask you to remain within the time frame that you will be given. I would like to ask the first lecturer, Professor Maria Carla Somma, to start the first lecture about Stone Society's representations of power through construction. Good morning. Before starting, I would like to thank the Cisam Foundation. This invitation is always a great pleasure for me. I would like to thank once again everyone. Every building, from the modest to the most courtly and monumental, is always the result of a strong voluntary act of man aimed at creating a built space that meets its needs and functions. Buildings, moreover, by their very materiality, go on to have a more or less lasting impact on the landscape, be it urban or rural, becoming one of its major transforming factors. The good preservation and elevation which characterizes the buildings of the 11th, 12th centuries is due in most cases to the persistence until the modern age of this settlement pattern of which they are an expression, and they are therefore an irreplaceable document for reconstructing the phases of formation which begins to emerge between the 10th and 11th centuries, both in the city and in the countryside. Given these peculiarities, buildings constitute a material expression that has always represented the privileged medium of the holders of power, and more generally of the hegemonic classes, to affirm and reaffirm their role. It is no coincidence that since antiquity there has been no lack of attention to them, from Vitruvius onward. One thinks for the 6th century of Procopius de Edificiis, which captures precisely in the building work of a distinctive feature of Justinian's policy. Even during the early Middle Ages, there was no lack of interest in buildings, reinterpreted in this phase in a symbolic and scriptural key. In the codices and in the building activity of the clergy and the monks. Even in modern historiography, buildings have played a central role in architectural history and art history. Far more recent, however, is the interest that archaeology has taken in buildings since the 1970s, particularly on the part of medieval archaeology. This has led to the development of a method related to the archaeology of architecture that analyzes buildings not only as an expression of styles, the work of artists or architectural masterpieces, but as the result of a production process closely linked to the environment that produced it, which allows us to read it all its phases, going back to the workers, costs, methods, and timing of its realization, and clients thus restoring to the buildings an irreplaceable and original function as a historical source. For the period under consideration here, we do not have the wealth of written sources that characterizes the centuries from the 13th onward, so the building remains the main source of itself. In this framework, the 11th century and more generally the time span between the late 10th and 12th centuries, with an extension up to the Black Death, constitutes a crucial moment of affirmation of the building product as an expression of secular and ecclesiastical power that combines in its materiality the instances of power, representation, propaganda, and functionality. This growth takes place in different ways and at different times in the European context, where parcelization, not least that of the powers themselves, is the norm, but where we see the gradual establishment of stone construction bound by lime mortar. This construction system allows, from a technological point of view, to build more solid structures larger complexes and developing height, elements that result in a greater impact of the buildings on the landscape, and also a marked change in scale compared to structures made of perishable material. An attempt will be made to retrace the stages and forms of this process in its varied expressions, without the ambition to be exhaustive, necessarily having to proceed by exemplar given the number of cases and the time available. As with all great phenomena, the underlying motivations are diverse and weigh differently depending on the places and different moments in time frame under consideration. Certainly, the economic factor has been determined by being in itself an onerous operation, especially when we are talking about constructions of some level. But the process has certainly benefited from a general dynamic and tendentially upward climate, also on the political, social, and cultural levels, in which construction has contributed to act as a driving force. From this point of view, it is significant that recent research projects have referred to this process as petrifying wealth, and increasingly in studies on this topic, we speak of petrified power or of collective identity, identifying the use of stone understood as a durable building material as the identifying and qualifying element of building in this period. The studies of the last decades have now provided a fairly clear picture of the forms of building in the early medieval period, in which we see, on the one hand, the systematic use, and in some cases of an excellent level used in prestige architecture, especially ecclesiastical, and on the other hand, the large-scale diffusion of building in a perishable material. It has been also pointed out that throughout this period, quality construction, at least at the residential level, did not represent the sole and exclusive manifestation of the ruling classes, still linked to other forms of ostentation of their role and wealth, such as clothing, gifts, precious materials, jewelry, in a word, sanctuary objects. From this starting situation, at least from the second half of the 10th century, the picture begins to change, starting with the position the buildings acquire in space, both in their relationship with the other buildings and with the morphology of the territory. Studies in the Anglo-Saxon sphere have shown, for example, how many castles are built in relation to disputes already settled in antiquity, with which the new construction establishes a symbolic and reinforcing link to the power of which it is an expression. This is, for example, the case of Porchester in Hampshire, where the Roman fort, after being abandoned by the Romans, became a Saxon settlement in which person of rank resides, and in the 10th century his residence is transformed into a castle by the Normans by going to occupy the corner of the Roman fort. It can be important for sovereigns to enhance a place because of its value to the dynasty, as in the case of the Feecamp castle commissioned by Richard II. Such complexes end up representing the sovereign authority more generally, even when not physically present, thanks in part to the context in which they are set. These choices not only strengthen the legitimacy of power, but in some cases allow for the recovery of ancient materials and structures useful for new constructions. If in the urban sphere spaces are more circumscribed, in the rural sphere power is expressed in the management of larger organized and fortified spaces. This pattern is found in France as early as the 7th century, and over time a variable structure also qualifies according to the large open areas it has around it, and in which certain activities that qualify the life of the upper classes can be carried out, from hunting to the garden, or a place closely linked to the daily life of women of rank. In cities, the emergence of masonry structures is grasped in the creation of defensive arrangements, as in the case of Genoa, where in the second half of the 10th century, the Bishop Castrum, the city's first masonry structure made of pebbles and flakes of medium and small collection sites, bound by excellent lime mortar, was renovated. At this time, defense structures affected not only urban centers, but also individual buildings of both secular and ecclesiastical rank, which until then had relied on spiritual protection linked to their sacredness. But after the serious events that had marked the 10th century, from Saracen to Hungarian raids, these had proved completely ineffective. This led to the adoption of defensive arrangements around monasteries, churches, and residences of rank that also contributed visually to enhancing their sacredness and prestige. See, for example, the fortified citadels of some episcopal sees such as Arezzo, or Valva, or monastic complexes, or the constant presence of towers or enclosures in relation to the seats of secular power, as in the case of the Byzantine Praetorian Nobari, and later also of aristocratic residences, as will be discussed shortly. The buildings that earlier seemed to acquire the new construction features and adopt stone as the qualifying material for the role are the buildings of worship, beginning with episcopal ones. In the Germanic area, a series of monuments of Ottonian and Salian patronage are the result of large building sites in which the use of the square work is quite peculiar, as in the case, for example, of the cathedral spire. The first of the 8 construction phases datable between 1027 and 1041, for the most part preserved, is in opus quadratum. This means that the construction should work. Each element in place as the wall grew according to the shape of the adjacent pieces. This system involved a great expenditure of material and the labor of stone masons. Roughly 190 hours were required to build the capital, and has its roots in Greek square work, so much so that the presence of Oriental labor is documented for these sites. Such construction methods also reached Italy, as shown, for example, the cases of the Ottonian phase of the Church of San Lorenzo in Milan, which involved the rebuilding of the roof of the Tetraconsus, much of the towers, and the masonry of the chapel of San Ippolito. The roofing, as assumed and proven by analysis of the fragments found, was a self-supporting structure of specially fabricated fictile tubules, as demonstrated by archaeometric analysis. And even in this case, technology again refers back to the East. In Pisa, recent excavations in Piazza dei Miracoli have unearthed the oldest cathedral, which construction started in the late 10th, early 11th centuries, and whose construction was also interrupted and then resumed with Busceto's grand design. This early church has vestments made of reused ashlars and unworked stones. In the case of Pisa, makes it possible to follow materially the transition from irregular small format lithic masonry to one in perfectly square stone, testifying to a gradual process that finds comparison in a whole series of churches commissioned by bishops that between the late 10th and first decades of the 11th century were rebuilt in mortar-bound stone material, but where many reused pieces are still present and the sizes and shapes of the lithic pieces are still very irregular. The process of the building sites of episcopal and commissioned churches begin to employ with some systematicity well square blocks of perfectly smoothed quarry. So, in general, 2 palazzum commissioned by bishops are built in the second half of the 11th century, one of cubic bulk on 2 floors in the castrum, and one of narrow elongated form, also on 2 floors at the cathedral. The construction technique of regular courses of bosses is used in both, and is also found in a monastic building in the area, San Fruttuoso in Portofino. In Florence, sources report that the bishop's palace had an atrium, a lobia maior, and a garden. The archaeological record returns a masonry building of rectangular plan with a tower on the northern boundary on the ground floor. More similar forms have also been proposed for the 11th century phase of the bishop's palace in Pistoia. The bishops of Arezzo between the 10th and 11th centuries made a major leap forward by building a real bishop's citadel on Pionta Hill, which has been the subject of archaeological excavation. The project was owed to the architect Maginard, who worked under several bishops and received land and a house on the hill in return. The early medieval cathedral was rebuilt, the bishop's palace and a church mausoleum over the tomb of Saint Donatus, and probably the fortification of the citadel were built ex novo. Less well known for this era, at least in Italy, are the urban royal, ducal, and marquis residences that were mostly destroyed as a result of turmoil related to royal succession, as we have heard these days for Pavia, for example, or by the advent of communal governments. Recent surveys in Lucca and Pisa are investigating areas where the sources attest to these residences, but the data are very limited. However, their location in areas outside the walls can be inferred. In Lucca as early as the 9th century, and in Pisa in the first half of the 11th century. From an architectural point of view, the sources report palaces with halls, heated rooms, porticos, churches, and gardens. With the process of mimesis that progressively invested first the circle closest to the sovereigns and ecclesiastical hierarchies, and later the aristocratic classes, until it involved the emerging merchant classes, the characteristics of the building of power are also found in urban housing of rank. An emblematic case, even in its precocity, is Genoa, where the curie of the great merchant families are attested as early as the 12th century. The Embriachic complex presents an early phase dated to the first half of the 12th century, and is the first example of a square work in Genoa, which finds comparison with the structures of the field of Byblos that the family owned in Lebanon, reinforcing in part, as seen earlier for the Cathedral of Spire. The idea that the reintroduction of litho technology in the West was meditated from the Middle Eastern area. These complexes consisted of the Domus Magna, where the head of the family resided, from the residences of other members of the family clan from one or more towers, the consortium square, and in some cases private churches that were completely untethered from bishop's control and depended directly on the family. In Pisa, excavation in Vicolo del Porton Rosso have unearthed an early 11th century wall structure that is perhaps one of the earliest evidence of the typical Pisan tower houses. Towers are undoubtedly the architectural form that best represents in this period the renewal of the architectural power, the prodromes of which can be detected as early as the early Middle Ages, as shown by the cases of the Lateran Palace, the Palace of Aachen and Salerno. By the time we're dealing with it, has now systematically entered the building complexes of rank, both in the city and in the rural sphere, declined in various forms, in various ways from the point of view of construction, but also function. Towers also appear in Rome in the second half of the 11th century, and for the city's nobility, they long represented the property of greatest prestige, economic value, and pragmatic value. With its form, it constitutes an instrument of defense and hegemony over restricted areas of urban territory. In the case of Rome, the symbolic intent is also detected by the construction technique involving an exterior of well-selected ancient bricks and internal tufa facing. Widening the horizon to rural areas, religious buildings seem to anticipate the use of lithic material as an exclusive component of their constructions. In Montieri, the rural rectory wanted by the bishop's authorities made of worked ashlars and well-squared ashlars, and is radiocarbon dated to the late 10th, early 11th century. In this case, the building presents a very particular iconography with a central plan provided with 6 apses. The particularity of the plan, as well as we shall see also for the Church of San Salvatore alla Miata, could be an expression of an international environment linked to the sovereigns and lay aristocracy, with whom the prelates had contacts, thus being able to mediate with different realities that were geographically far away. At about the same time, in fact, the abbot of the monastery of San Salvatore al Montamiato, thanks to the support of the Marquis of Tuscany and Otto III, became the reconstruction of the complex, creating in the church one of the most extensive crypts in Europe, which finds comparisons in the Transalpine area in the same cathedral of Spire mentioned above. A project of recent years, which has been referred to often these days, has made it possible to focus on the development of the rural Tuscan settlement of Vetricella, identified by the sources with the center of the Curtis of Valli, the seat of a large royal estate. The centrality of its functions is also noted in terms of building choices. The settlement plays a natural hump, artificially raised over time, is provided with a wooden tower with a housing function in the center of 3 moats. The tower, protected by a wooden enclosure, is reconstructed in more complex forms with the introduction of a stone base to support a wooden or mixed material elevation. A small worship building made of perishable material is built next to the tower, within which a cemetery space is created. The project had to require a large amount of mortar, hence the presence of no less than 2 mixes. The situation at Vetricella finds comparisons from the point of view of building techniques with other sites in Tuscany, and beyond that, see the formation of the first encastellated sites with early stone or stone and mixed material wall circuits, such as Miranduolo, where in the late 10th, early 11th phase, there are houses with abundant stone and elevation made of perishable material. The walled enclosure with a mortar-bonded masonry base and elevation made of rubber poles and pressed earth, covered with a thick layer of plaster for protection, while the Church of St. John the Evangelist built entirely of stone. In Donoratico, from the mid-10th century, the construction totally in stone of the city wall, a defensive redoubt, the tower and the church began. All these cases are linked by the red thread of mortar mixers, which probably testify to a unified building program in the countryside in the Ottonian age, which for Tuscany coincides with the Marquisate of Tuscia, with 2 modes of construction. One that we could define as secular, with the attention to the grandeur and layout of the structure with the use of Lxxi pezzame, but also perishable material. A building typology that could be a marker of this phase could be a building with a rectangular or square plan developed on 1 or 2 floors made of masonry or mixed technique, such as the building in Arcidosso, interpreted by Nucciotti as the seat of an official of the Marquis of Tuscia. Between the late 10th and 11th centuries, therefore, it can be seen that in the countryside of central northern Italy, investment in stone construction is rather modest and in very diverse firms, mainly involving city walls, but also touriform structures, even large ones, and especially religious buildings.
Invece più o meno
In Apulia, on the other hand, more or less the same years witnessed the founding of centers that followed the Byzantine reconquest of southern Italy between the late 9th and 10th century. At Vaccarizza, the Byzantine praetorian has been recognized in pebbles and little or no worked stones bound by clay, combined perhaps with a pisé technique for the upper floors. In these cases, workers with locally matured technical knowledge of a traditional matrix seem to be employed, which will date back to the Roman and late antique ages, favored by the on-site availability of the material that constitutes the geological substrate of much of the tavoliere. External input in this case will therefore be related only to the design of the new urban layout. In the case of Montegorvino, on the other hand, Byzantine faces were found in the western part of the church, which represents a sack masonry with cobblestone faces of various shapes with split face work placed in roughly horizontal courses with recourse to wedges bound by lime mortar. In the same building, there is a second phase with horizontal courses of squared blocks finished with an enchevron technique attested in Apulia Norman context and the sign of skilled workers. The attribution of this phase to the Norman Swabian age is also connoted by the adaptation of the plan to Transalpine models. The case of Montegorvino seems to reconnect precisely with the time of the territorial conquest of the Normans, as is also found in Sicily and Calabria. Their revival is linked above all to the affirmation of castral models, but it also determines a noticeable change in ecclesiastical building, as is found in northern Apulia, especially in the 12th and 13th century, with the appearance of masonry in blocks of different modules. The Normans are distinguished at the building level above all by the castral model attributed to them, that of the motti, which we found in all the territories conquered by these people, starting in northern France and spreading in England and southern Italy. The earliest records of this pattern date from the late 10th to the 11th century and are an unmistakable expression of power over the territory that is visibly altered by it, but at least initially without the use of durable material construction. They consist of a truncated cone made by accumulating and pressing earth and sand. For the motte of a caillon, for example, made in the 12th century, calculation was made on the time required for its construction and the amount of labor employed. The structure, 3.7 meters high, 60 meters wide at the base, and 31.37 at the top, required 2 months of work and the labor of 20 to 25 workers. Their priority defensive function is attested by the materials found, such as weapons and horse finishes. In England, Domen is the first such castle of complex structure built by Roger of Montgomery between 1070 and 1080 in an area with a very long settlement history. It consists of a motte surrounded by a moat with, at the top in the first phase, a 5.5 meter square wooden building, perhaps with 2 stories. The adjoining baileys was protected by a double embankment and moat. Again, the structures were wooden. Examples are also found in southern Italy, where from the mid-11th century, castrons and installations multiplied in conjunction with the progressive military occupation by the Normans. Vaccarezza, Byzantine pre-existence are completely obliterated, and a wooden tower on motte is erected within a motte and bailey model scheme. The Donion at Monte Corvino is built on the ruins of the Byzantine center on the artificial rise protected by a moat. Returning to the French territory, the residences of power, mostly preserved in rural settings and the subject of a long and conspicuous tradition of study, often supplement what had been the traditional symbols of Carolingian-era power, the old chapel, chamber, and economic center, with the new symbols represented by the donjon and motte. For the 10th century, the finest example of a palatial scheme is the Carolingian tradition is the great comital hall at Angers, preserved several meters in height. It is a rectangular volume measuring 27 times 12 meters, lit by 8 large round windows, richly decorated with carved jumps. One of the oldest buildings is the first hall of Dieu de la Fontaine from the 10th century, although it is smaller in size, as are those of Antony and Fécamp. An interesting example is the residence of the Counts of Anjou in Tours, which makes use of the late ancient walls of the city. It consists of a tower, perhaps as a private residence, and a 2-story rectangular building with the ground floor for service use and second floor with a hall. Other examples are those of Mayenne by the Counts of Maine in the mid-10th century, at Lxxi, which 4 floors are preserved. And there are many comfort examples, such as latrines, fireplaces. The classrooms that characterize these residences with time tend to become larger and larger and acquire institutional function as places of writing, royal and princely diplomas, as evidenced by the indications of the documents themselves. These are complexes in which the residential function tends to become more prevalent than the military and defensive function, acquiring all the elements in terms of services, decorum, and functionality of dwellings of the highest rank, and flaunting at the level of construction beautiful stone wall faces. As we have seen, the commissioners of the complexes presented are part of the secular and ecclesiastical elites of the time. In particular, a leading role of monarchy seems to emerge between the 10th and 11th centuries, which find, especially in religious architecture, but not only, if we think of the case of Vetricella, a reference of prestige and the source of consensus to obtain the support of the ecclesiastical aristocracy. Robert the Pious, for example, for the collegiate church of Saint Agnan in Orleans, rebuilt and consecrated by the king in 1029, as the same king who prescribes, as his biographer recalls, the use of a very precise architectural model to be followed in the new construction, which finds confirmation in the material datum attesting to the attention of the king and his ecclesiastical entourage to new architectural concepts. In southern Italy, from the 10th century, the Byzantines, as part of the reorganization of the reconquered territories, promoted both civil and religious building activity as capital and increased it, promoting promoting the construction of defensive structures and palaces representative of imperial power. The destructions carried out by the Normans deprive us of knowledge of most of these structures, but in the case of body excavations in recent years are investigating the era of the Praetorian seat of the Catapano, on which the Basilica of St. Nicholas will be built. At the moment, the excavation and given a few traces on the country, some elements of the Byzantine Praetorium can be seen in the structures at the basis of the bell tower of the Basilica or in some sections of the walled enclosure in later buildings. Like the kings, the bishops are perhaps among the most active, along with the abbots, in these extraction operations. Caslino, Bishop of Padua, the bishops of Arezzo, whose work on the Pionta Hill we have described, and the abbots to whom we owe the reconstruction in monumental forms of the major European monasteries, beginning with Desiderio and the Abbey of Monte Cassino. But this was discussed already by Leonora de Stefani. On the other hand, for the church, well before the year 1000, building policy takes on central value, in which the use of stone also has symbolical and allegorical value, in which the stones represent the saints and doctors of the church. The highest expressions of secular and ecclesiastical powers were flanked by aristocracies, as in the case of Marquis patronage in northern Italy. During the Kingdom of Italy, the marches became privileged sites for the reworking of power, and expression of which are, for example, the new foundations of churches and monasteries that took the form of private entities under strong dynastic control, as in the case of the Obertenghi and their monastery of San Giovanni in Vicolo Marchese near Piacenza, or the Canossa family with the monastery of Brescello and the rectory of Santa Apollonia in the fortress of Canossa, and the most important foundation of the family, the monastery of San Benedict at Polirone, founded in 1007 by Dedalo, son of Adalberto. For the Laramic family, the case of Marquis Alberto is very interesting because in 1030 founded the Church of Santa Giustina di Sezzadio in the diocese of Acqui, with the exceptional presence of the mosaic floor, one of the earliest preserved in northern Italy, with a dedicatory inscription celebrating the founder placed in front of the altar of the crypt where the relics have been. It should not be forgotten that secular commissions in the religious sphere have an oblative connotation, but they also represent the material affirmation of their strength, of their authority over the territory, destined to last over time, like their castles. A final note about the clients concerns the role of aristocratic women, very common in Germany, France, and the Iberian Peninsula, less so in Italy, but with the important exception of the Canossa dynasty, starting with Hildegard, wife of Adalbert, who founded the monastery of Brescello, and the more famous Matilda. These extensive and wide-ranging building programs naturally imply the strengthening of building sites, their articulation, but also different modes in the acquisition, processing, and organization of materials. The datum that emerged rather across the board in all contexts is a continuity of the use of perishable material, which especially in the initial phase of this process comes together with the appearance of the lithic material, which seems then to characterize exclusively cut buildings. Still between the mid-10th and early 11th centuries, even in eras of public and elevated patronage, the use of stone and lime mortar is more related to accentuating the solidity of the building itself and its design value. Moreover, at this stage, the main element seems to be not so much the stone always used without any kind of processing as the lime mortar, just Miranduolo Vetricella. Just the case of Vetricella shows that still at the end of the 10th century, wood is an important element even in prominent context. The use of worked and mortar-bound stone thus occurs gradually and seems to characterize religious buildings initially. Its use, especially when pieces acquire homogeneous dimensions and tend to increase in size, effectively rendering collection pieces no longer usable, implies the activation of quarries and the organization of a system of transport to the site and its processing by stonemasons, who are all the more capable the higher the level of workmanship. Some types of stone preserve traces of this workmanship, allowing the use of specific tools and particular methods of squaring and surface treatment to be recognized, such as the un-chiffon workmanship that was widespread in France between the 10th and 12th centuries. The use of large blocks also implies the presence of lifting machines. At the end of this period, in areas where there is clay availability, brick production also resumes substantially. Like in Pomposa, Tuscany, northern Apulia, from where degraded terracotta tiles come from context of the 10th, 11th centuries. A central role in construction, as noted, is given by the binder, especially of lime mortar, which together with stone constitutes the discriminating element of rank building. Its production necessitates a complex production cycle, from finding suitable lithic material to firing, slaking, and curing the lime, and then mixing it with water and aggregates, usually on foot, to make up the binder. The archaeological data is seen as unearthed a particular piece of machinery, the mixer, that served to facilitate the final operation, consisting of a wooden frame. Its presence on the building site finds widespread use in the Germanic area, where it was probably developed. But there are also numerous examples in Italy, and especially in Tuscany, in connection with high commissioned building sites, whose links with the brass kings, with the kings may have facilitated the acquisition of the technical knowledge of their construction. The allogenic presence of professionals is sometimes clued, as in the case of Apulia, by different procedures proper to the working of mortar. Here, in 11th, 12th century phases, mortar is found laid without cooling, according to a procedure well attested in historic and traditional building in northern countries. Even in Sicily, where throughout the Islamic phase the use of light mortar is not found, it appears systematically in buildings linked to royal patronage and restricted aristocracy linked to the ruling dynasty after the Norman conquest. The great building work on the 11th century also brings with it a new impact to the use of reused material, which is often flaunted as much as an expression of the wealth of the patron who was able to come into possession of it, as well as an instrument of accreditation of power, placing itself in continuity with the towers of the past. Examples include the Valdvin complex, the Pisa Cathedral, and St. Nicholas of Bari. The reuse of these materials, except in cases where they could be sourced locally, as in the case of Corfino, also entailed significant costs and transportation difficulties, as the Cassinense Chronicon well attests to us regarding Abbot Desiderius' trip to Rome to source spolia for the new factory and their subsequent transport to the monastery. It is mainly the buildings and their component elements that in most cases provide indications of the type of building site that produced them. The building site, by its nature and function, is destined to disappear at the end of construction, so it is not very common to have material knowledge of it. Some excavations have brought to light some of them all significantly coeval with complexes built in the period under consideration. For direct knowledge and by way of example, I present the building site of the Valvinian Cathedral at Corfino, rebuilt by Bishop Gian Simondo in the last quarter of the 11th century and remained active for almost 80 years. Here, the building site extended over a large area with a very precise organization of spaces allocated to different activities, from the footwork of stone material, mortar preparation, lime extinguishing, metallurgical activities, and the building site barrack. In the absence of material data or written sources, materials laying decorations are indicative of the organization of the site and the presence of different specializations. The spread of lapidary signs are another telltale sign of a more articulated coordination among the workers, both in the construction phases of the buildings and in the material production chain, where increasingly the one who packages the material is not the one who lays it. Of course, the world of the workers also acquires a new dimension and is invested by a process of emancipation. Certainly, their degree of specialization increases, as is evident from the buildings themselves, but it is difficult to define linguistically. The different professional figures are defined in the sources with Latin terms that are, however, far from unambiguous in meaning. Frequent and is that of cementarios, latomoi, lapicidi, fornaxari, muratores. Appear even the qualification of magister as strong fluctuations. The anonymity that had characterized the craftsmen during the early Middle Ages also seems now to have disappeared. New role and consideration is given to the figure of the architect, who is the object of public honors, conveyed also by epigraphy. In Italy, we have the greatest attestation of this, an early case being that of the Magister Mausulo and Deus Dedit, who left their signatures on the facade, portico, and bell tower of Pomposa Abbey. To an exponent of the workers in the service of Transmondo at Balba should be referred the memory left on one of the ashlars of the facing with an uncertain handwriting by a certain Hugh. A final point should be made about the economic implications that all this building activity generates. In the earliest phases of this process and in eras characterized by a weak economy, we should not think that building durable material necessarily represents the expression of a solid economic availability. Rather, it could be the result of the greater availability of labor and resources, as seems to indicate all those complex masonry techniques, that is, those that do not involve any kind of stone working, the work of workers with a low level of specialization, which in many cases can be found among locally available labor, as well as the same stone material that is the result of simple harvesting. It is a different matter when construction techniques are refined and above all squared stone is used, to which decorative apparatuses are added. Level arrangements such as heating systems, water conservatories, latrines, facilities for the preservation of foodstuffs, all operations that require specialized labor, often transportation, procurement of raw materials not available locally, and a substantial extension of construction time. On these aspects, with regard to the assessment of costs and time, research had been directed in recent years, trying to establish their magnitude in objective terms. It is clear that from the end of the 11th century onward, in building construction, in building production by the elites, there is an exponential increase in the wealth invested. But by now, their very role is inconceivable without its architectural expression, that is related to defense, public functions, residence, and/or recreation. In this vein, the emerging classes who base their own social ascendancy on the availability of money, as well as the new powers embodied by municipal governments, would also soon move along this line. Thank you.
Ringraziamo Maria Carla Somma per questa relazione così ricca.
Thank you for this rich lecture. And now, I'm very glad to give the floor to Professor Holger Klein with the lecture entitled Byzantine Art in and Beyond the West During the Long 11th Century, Infusing the Byzantine Question with a Global Perspective.
Buongiorno a tutti. Prima di cominciare una parola di ringraziamento agli organizzatori del convegno e al Consiglio Scientifico.
So first of all, I would like to thank the scientific committee and everyone here at Cisam for organizing this wonderful event. I am actually very happy to be here. For me, this is my first time in Spoleto. I am very much enjoying the debates during this week, and I would also like to express my gratitude and thanks to Alessandra Messare, to the interpreters and translators, and to the entire staff of the event for supporting us throughout this week. I will now speak in English.
Begin by setting some chronological and epistemological boundaries for my investigation, which, as the title of my paper indicates, attempts to explore both a select number of tangible, that is, material traces of the history and impact of Byzantine art and culture in what in academic shorthand has often been called the West or the Latin West, as well as some aspects of the historiography of the so-called Byzantine question, a debate that first emerged in 19th century German antiquarian circles as an attempt to assess the contribution and influence of Byzantine art and culture on the development of Western medieval art and the emergence of Renaissance Italy and Northern Europe. While time is short, I will try to tackle these two distinct yet intimately connected elements jointly in an effort to highlight and problematize past and present scholarly efforts to describe our own conscious and subconscious biases and blind spots in assessing Byzantine-Western relations in the realm of art, culture, and, almost inevitably, medieval politics. In certain aspects, especially as far as Italy and Germany are concerned, the 11th century is perhaps the most crucial period for the development and consolidation of Byzantine-Western artistic and cultural relationships. However, the stage for more sustained interactions between East and West was already set somewhat earlier, namely in the second half of the 10th century, and its most tangible ripple effects can be observed well into the first half of the 12th century. I am thus taking the liberty to expand my focus from the more strictly defined boundaries of the century following the millennial watershed to the long 11th century of relations between Byzantine and Western political, especially imperial actors and their respective agents. Jointly, they helped to usher in a new era of interest in and appreciation for the Byzantine luxury arts and their unparalleled material and technical refinement and sophistication. If it were necessary to define more specific chronological markers for the beginning and end of this long 11th century, I would probably set them with the coronation of the Saxon king Otto I as Roman emperor by Pope John XII on February 2nd, 962, and the death of the Norman King Roger II of Sicily on February 26, 1154. However, tying such broader phenomena as stylistic assimilation, iconographic adaptation, and the creative reworking of artistic motifs and models to specific historical events and figures rarely does justice to the complexities of such exchanges and the specific local circumstances, intellectual frameworks, or economic environments within which they occurred. As Henry Meyer Harting and others have argued, for instance, the moment when Otto I became Imperator Augustus could certainly be understood as a watershed moment in the history of the relation between the Byzantine Empire and an ambitious German dynasty that started to claim, or rather reclaim, the Roman imperial title with all associated expectations of unlimited universal rulership. But it neither explains nor fully accounts for the increasing receptiveness towards Byzantine art and culture in Ottonian circles, which started even before Otto's efforts to secure a Byzantine bride for his heir, or the manufacture of the two most well-known artistic products commonly associated with the eventual marriage of Otto II to Theophanu in Rome on April 14, 972. I'm speaking, of course, of the so-called marriage charter, currently preserved at the State Archives of Lower Saxony in Wolfenbüttel, and the ivory plaque depicting the double coronation of Otto II and Theophanu at the Musée Cluny in Paris. Our reading or interpretation of such works is, to quote Bill North and Anthony Cutler, largely shaped by the perceptions and interpretations of those who have come before us, and marked by the situation in which the thing was and is to be found, the class of object into which it has been inserted, and the role that it has previously been set to play, end of quote. In other words, how we interpret a work of art in this particular and in other circumstances is by no means neutral or an objective endeavor. As I will try to show in the next 40 minutes or so, our own place in a fragmented, globalized, and increasingly multipolar world has significant relevance, not only for the way we understand and assess our own scholarly tradition and trajectory, but also for the way we define and measure Byzantium's cultural and artistic impact on its neighbors. In other words, how we as scholars today pose and answer the Byzantine question is inextricably linked to our own time, geographical location, intellectual formation, national, cultural, and/or religious heritage, ideological outlook, and political persuasion, to name only the most obvious categories relevant in this context. The same is true if we take the longer historiographical view and try to evaluate how scholars of past generations have answered the Byzantine question in their own time. The issue of perspective, historical and otherwise, is crucial in this respect, as our understanding of the past cannot be disassociated from our understanding of the present. The changing assessment of the impact of Byzantine art and culture on its neighbors is therefore necessarily more revealing about us than about the Byzantines and their various neighbors across the broad span of time we identify as the period of our scholarly inquiry, namely the 11th century. A re-evaluation of the Byzantine question in our own time, which in a different context I have tentatively called the age of global thought, seems to therefore be justified and is perhaps overdue at a time when descriptive binaries such as Byzantium or Europe, East and West, Greek or Latin, may be considered to have lost at least some of their usefulness. The fact these broad categories still haunt us today, nearly 25 years into the 21st century, is probably owed less to academic inertia than to the difficulty of identifying more appropriate tools and mechanisms for what amounts to a challenging hermeneutic endeavor. If our goal is a more nuanced understanding of the complex phenomena that undergird the movement of people, objects, and ideas across cultural, religious, and geographic divides, we will need to revise our terminology in order to reform our scholarly practice. Where the question of artistic, or more broadly speaking, cultural exchange is addressed today, it generally transcends the narrow Eurocentric binary that once defined it. About a decade ago, Alicia Walker expressed the hope that a global approach to medieval studies may reveal its greatest usefulness in providing us with a way to resist, quote, the casting of intercultural relations in reductive bilateral terms, and instead laying the ground for the recognition of the complex and multidirectional networks that shape the distribution of goods, movements of populations, and traffic in ideas and works of art. End of quote. At least in some quarters, such hopes have materialized. But the more recent past has also underscored the dangers inherent in the resurgence of nationalism and an insistence on the validity of nativist interpretations of culture. Since it is ultimately direct contact as a result of the movement of people, objects, and ideas that leads to the adaptation of previously foreign visual motifs, stylistic idioms, artistic techniques, and iconographic formulae, we may want to pay attention more to the historical circumstances and context in which cultural and artistic appropriation and amalgamation took place. If nothing else, what our global awareness today may help us to achieve is a clearer recognition and awareness for the pitfalls and limitations imposed on us by frameworks and categories used in 20th century scholarship. What we may be able to offer today is an approach characterized by more interdisciplinarity and diversity, and a practice that is at once global, local, and collaborative. I will return to our contemporary predicament in assessing the Byzantine question at the end of my talk, but for now, let me sketch out, albeit in very broad strokes, some trends of the debate as it emerged during the 19th and 20th centuries. In 1854, when the German jurist Karl Schnaase, one of the founders of the modern discipline of art history in Germany, coined the term Byzantinische Frage, or Byzantine question, in his Geschichte der bildenden Kunst, Künste, and thus introduced the debate into a nascent art historical discourse, the importance of Byzantine art and culture and its impact on the formation of Western European art and architecture had already been recognized and discussed among antiquarians and connoisseurs of an earlier generation. Already in 1817, for instance, the Cologne art collector Sulpice Boiseret emphasized in a letter to his friend Johann Wolfgang von Goethe that, quote, anyone who is at all impartial and properly informed will never deny the influence, indeed even the long-standing dominance of Byzantine art in Italy and Germany, end of quote. Boiseret's conviction that Byzantine art had reigned supreme in Europe for many centuries did, however, not go unchallenged. Only a decade later, in 1827, the artist and connoisseur Carl Friedrich von Rumor took a more critical stance when he wrote that in Germany, people like to call everything Byzantine, in which those features that only developed later as hallmarks of a German school do not yet stand out, end of quote. Rumor's criticism of the vague terminology and synonymous use of the terms such as Christian, Byzantine, and Greek among the Romantic writers of his generation was well justified. But it cannot be taken as a general rejection of the idea that works of Byzantine art were meritless in their own right, or indeed served Western artists as models across Italy and Germany. Rumor's study of paintings in the collections of Rome and Florence led him to conclude that, quote, the painting of the Greek Middle Ages, especially from the epoch of the 9th to the beginning of the 13th century, differs from Italian painting of the same period, first and all through better execution, a great wealth in models, and consequently through real merits in content as well as technique. It was these very merits, according to Rumor, that had inspired a revival of Italian artistic tradition starting as early as the 13th century. What may be surprising is that despite the positive assessment, Rumor's judgment on Byzantine mentality and culture overall remained fundamentally negative. A little further in the same chapter he wrote, and I quote, the same people whose technical superiority provided such powerful support for the aspiring art of modern Italy was barbaric in regard to its moral and spiritual development. Its technical superiority rested not so much on active striving for perfection, but on the fortuitous circumstances that urban life had survived in the Eastern Empire. In addition, the Greek artists have a greater wealth of models, had more choice, if not exactly the desire and ability to invent their own. Where it was a question of finding new types for new ideas in reality or of showing one's own choice and invention, the helplessness of their spirit and the rawness of their taste betray themselves everywhere in their work. Rumor's negative evaluation of Byzantine culture as decadent and oriental was shared by the Berlin art historian Franz Kugler, who in his influential Handbook of Art History from 1842 described the Byzantine Empire in even starker terms. The Byzantine Empire and its thousand-year paralysis with its despotism, its cruelties, its indolence is indeed notorious. It can count as one of the most unpleasant parts of history. On the throne, despotic cruelty or degrading cowardice, among the people, sensual striving, lust for pomp and servile sense, science, a dead collector, art, fading. The sensuality of the Greeks, the soft luxury of the Orientals, the greed of the Romans was widespread through the empire. This Oriental element of the late Roman spirit now gained decisive preponderance in the Eastern Empire after its separation from the Western provinces. The capital itself lay on the border with Asia, and the most important provinces belonged entirely to this part of the world. We must therefore firmly regard the Byzantine Empire as an Oriental one, end of quote. There can be no doubt that Kugler's empathetically negative image of the Byzantine Empire was directly inspired by those of his teacher Hegel, who in his lectures on the philosophy of history had voiced similar concerns 20 years earlier. Hegel's views in turn are part of a much longer historiographical tradition that leads back to Herder's ideas on the philosophy of history and Gibbon's history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, to Montesquieu and Tillemont and others, who all agreed that the Byzantine Empire was corrupted as a result of its geographic location and contact with its eastern neighbors. Schnarzer, Rumor, and Kugler were not the only art historians of their generation who promoted the view of Byzantine art and culture as deprived and oriental. Academic personalities who deserved to be called out for their views in this context are, above all, the art historian Anton Springer, who first addressed the Byzantine question in 1857 and characterized the history of the Byzantine Empire as deeply decadent, effeminate. Where men leave the ruler's baton to women, imitate women's customs themselves, and betray effeminate attitudes, education must also reveal many wrong and sick things. The nature of Byzantine art can easily be understood from what has been said. As a result of the geographic influences and close contact with the peoples of the East, it will retain a variety of Oriental features, and such can be found both in architecture and painting. Springer sums up his assessment of Byzantine art by stating that its fate was, quote, linked to that of the Byzantine Empire. It perished in barbarism in its own homeland and gave way to independent national movements in the West. But it was Byzantine art that prevented the complete interruption of artistic activity and saved outward representational skill and ideal types, end of quote. When Springer returned to the Byzantine question 20 years later, the research landscape had significantly shifted. In his 1886 essay, Byzantine Art and Its Influences on the West, Springer not only conceded that Byzantine art ranked, quote, in many respects higher than the contemporary Occidental culture in the West, but that, quote, in the early Middle Ages, that is in the 9th through 11th century, it towered over Occidental art in many respects. We give Byzantine art the honor of a living art strongly developed from native roots, which in the early Middle Ages far surpassed Western art in beauty and wealth. This last concession, however, includes the demand that our Western art be understood as an independent art as well. Byzantine art had no influence on the North in the later Middle Ages, while in Italy it was limited to a certain geographical landscape and individual branches of the arts, end of quote. Since time constraints prevent me from focusing more fully on the other prominent authors of this period, let me simply emphasize that Springer was not alone, was not a lone voice in his negative assessment of Byzantine art and culture. Others could be cited with similar misogynistic and nationalist statements emphasizing Western culture's hegemony and the expanse of a Byzantine cultural tradition that is portrayed as corrupted by both its geographical location and long history of contacts with its eastern neighbors. More positive views finally started to emerge around the turn of the 20th century with George Count Witztum of Eckstedt, a medieval art historian no longer widely known, who held his inaugural lecture at the University of Leipzig in 1910, and who emphasized that, quote, the Byzantine question is hardly disputed today. There is incontrovertible evidence that Byzantine art exerted its influence on the West throughout the Middle Ages. The task now arises of finding an explanation for this fact, determining the extent of the influence and the type of its processing. The Byzantine models, which Western artists saw in abundance, must have awakened in them the idea of the possibility of a monumental style. I'll skip over the last part of this quote. Despite such intrepid views, the rise of nationalism across Europe during the 1910s and 20s did not fail to have a brief impact on the Byzantine question. In his 1935 treatise on the art of the German Empire, Wilhelm Pinder, for once, characterized the influence of Byzantine art and culture as an imminent danger and sign of inevitable decline, and I quote, in Otto III, the grandson of an Italian and the son of a Greek, the connection with Byzantium became a real threat to Germanness. He was ashamed of his Saxon origins and wanted to set up a real southern empire with his friend Gerbert of Reims as a pope. It was a good thing for him and us that he died so early and was succeeded by another German-blooded successor in the Bavarian Henry II. Despite, or perhaps as a result of such nationalist relapses, Witztum's call for a more rigorous academic study of the Byzantine question was taken up by a younger generation of scholars during and after the Second World War, whose primary interest was in the style-defining role of Byzantine art and the model character of its iconographic formulae. Among these scholars was Wilhelm Köhler, who held a professional position at the University of Jena before emigrating to the United States in 1932 to take up a position at Harvard, who stressed that the profound importance of Byzantine art for the stylistic development of the pictorial arts of France during the Romanesque period. Pointing to the frescoes of Berzé-la-Ville and other 12th century monuments, he identified several waves of Byzantine influence as a crucial factor behind the stylistic changes in the pictorial arts of medieval Europe. And I'll just show you this example as one of his more focused directives on the damp fold style of the figures depicted here from Berzé-la-Ville and Gospel Lectionary in Cluny. In Köhler's wake, it was particularly the work of Ernst Kitzinger, Kurt Weitzmann, Otto Demus, and a few others of their generation who, from the 1950s to 70s, fundamentally reshaped our knowledge and understanding of the model character of Byzantine monuments and their impacts on Western artists and patrons. Thus, efforts to orientalize the Byzantine Empire and its cultural products in the later 19th and early 20th century gradually gave way to a tendency to Europeanize Byzantine art and culture in the second half of the 20th century, a trend that finds its perhaps most visible expression in the programmatic title of the Ninth Council of Europe exhibition in Athens in 1964, Byzantine Art, a European Art, which acted like a spark plug for a new interest in the Byzantine question in the following years. As Otto Demus put it in his own essay for the exhibition, Byzantium was now considered a master teacher, the greatest between the antique and the Gothic. 6 years later, in his well-known book Byzantine Art and the West, he further defined his own scholarly goal as an effort to, quote, show the role Byzantium played in the development of Western art, with a stress not on the influences, but on the function of Byzantine artists and as teachers and pacemakers, and on the object lessons provided by Byzantine models in the West. And I'm showing you an image of Torcello and the absent Torcello and the view into the lagoon as a shorthand for this, because Demus's work obviously focused very much on Venice and the role of a first generation of Byzantine artists on the local talent that took over the work and succeeded. Unfortunately, there's no room here to develop this historiographic trend further. Suffice it to say that new voices started to emerge in the historiography in the 1980s, raising concerns about the appropriateness of the teacher-student model so strongly advocated by Demus and others. For criticism centered on the term influence, as well as Köhler's wave metaphor, in which such Byzantine influence was said to have manifested itself across Europe, the same can be said. This younger generation of American and European scholars, some of them trained or intellectually formed by the previous generation of German and Austrian émigré art historians, forcefully advocated for a more nuanced and differentiated understanding of Byzantine art and Western medieval art. The rise of critical and post-colonial theory, and more recently, the global turn in medieval studies, have done much to accelerate these trends and have sensitized us for the role Byzantium played, or might have played, as a bridge, a catalyst, an incubator, a mediator of artistic and cultural transfer processes in more than one geographical direction. Responding to the need for more nuance and greater differentiations, the recently published Routledge Companion to Byzantium and the West 900 to 1200 accordingly features subsections entitled Byzantium and the Multifaceted Latin World and Agents and Objects, in an effort to broaden the spectrum of scholarly perspectives and hermeneutical approaches. The volume's editors, well aware of the complexity of the issue at hand, stress that, quote, terminological difficulties have to be taken into consideration when speaking about medieval Byzantine relations. Such a label is, of course, completely anachronistic and at the same time seems to be rather blurred with regard to the West. First of all, this term has purely geographical meaning, but at the same time it risks evoking inappropriate and essentialist overtones about distinctive features of the Occident or the nascent Western world, viewed in contrast with the Byzantine tradition. End of quote. With regard to the Byzantine tradition, Mark Lauksterman and Mark Wittow have recently taken a similarly nuanced approach when they describe Byzantium during the 11th century as a place that, quote, is all about being in between, whether this is between Basil II and Alexios Komnenos, between the forces of the Normans, the Pechenegs, and the Turks, or between different social groupings, cultural identities, and religious persuasions, end of quote. I would like to advocate a similar in-betweenness as a state of mind when reflecting the Byzantine question, and a focus on modes of communication and exchange as a means of bridging spatial, cultural, political, and religious divides. For the remainder of my talk, let me thus go back to the evidence of art and the way this in-betweenness as a state of mind might play out in art historical practice. I have already mentioned the ivory plaque depicting the standing figures of Otto II and Theophanu crowned by Christ and accompanied by the figure of a certain monk John who, crouching at Otto's feet, implores Christ by the way of an adjacent Greek inscription to have mercy on him. Notwithstanding old and more recent claims that this plaque is a 19th century forgery, I include it here as a genuine medieval artifact that I believe it still is. The inscriptions identifying Otto as Imperator Romanorum Augustus and Theophanu as Imperatrix Augusta in a mix of Greek and Latin letters have been taken to indicate a date of manufacture between 982 and 983, namely the year or two preceding the death of Otto II on December 7th, 983. But while such a narrow dating or date range has been widely accepted since Percy Ernst Tramm emphasized that the chancery of Otto II did not use the title Imperator Romanorum consistently before March 982, the use of the title Imperator Romanorum or Imperator Romanorum Augustus may be less an obstacle to an earlier date than Schramm believed. As a polemical gesture pointed directly against the Byzantines, such titulature is already used quite effectively in the opening lines of Luitprand of Cremona's account of his legatio to Constantinople in 968. Here, Luitprand offers his homage to Otto I, his wife Adelheid, and his son Otto II, addressing them as, quote, Ottones Romanorum invictissimos imperatores Augustus glorissimamque Adelheidem imperatricem Augustam. If the person responsible for the commission and execution of the ivory was indeed John Philagatos, the Greek monk from Rossano and Calabria, who served as Chancellor of Italy in 980 to 982 and later Archimandrite of the Imperial Abbey of Nonantola, it is tempting to consider that the ivory was indeed commissioned much earlier, namely on the occasion of the celebration of the imperial couple's marriage and Theophanu's coronation in St. Peter on April 14, 972. And that it was made locally in an Italian, perhaps even a Roman workshop. While details in the depiction of the imperial robes and gestures betray the hand of an artist not deeply familiar with Byzantine customs and conventions, the panel style and iconography consciously assimilate, as has long been noted, contemporary Byzantine examples, such as the double coronation of Romanos II and Bertha Eudokia in the Cabinet de Médailles in Paris. The iconography of the plaque and the titulature of its inscriptions participate, I would argue, in a broader attempt to emulate and assimilate Byzantine court culture at a critical moment in the history of Ottonian rule in Italy. The marriage charter, which I have already shown, and which recently received attention by John Osborne, should be cited as a second object to have actively participated in this effort. Almost certainly executed in Rome in a scriptorium of or near the Church of Holy Apostles by a team of scribes and craftsmen astutely familiar with Byzantine aesthetic norms and artistic practices, this legal document, unique in its artistic conception and execution, is composed of 3 parchment sheets stitched together to form a single scroll and was stained with iron oxide and madder to resemble the purple murex dye widely used in the Eastern Mediterranean. The scroll is further decorated with 7 full and 1/2 pair of medallions with inscribed scenes of fierce lions and griffins subduing more peaceful animals, thus imitating the appearance of a patterned silk textile with embroidered borders over which the charter's text was applied in gold ink. Much like the earlier Ottonianum, in which Otto I reconfirmed papal rights and possessions shortly after his imperial coronation in February 962, the marriage charter appropriates the format of Byzantine diplomatic documents in a conscious effort to emulate Byzantine artistic practices and diplomatic customs. It does so, however, in an even more creative and effective way by imitating an entirely different artistic genre and technique, namely that of Byzantine silks. The Cluny ivory, with its double coronation of Otto and Theophanu through the hands of Christ, similarly engages in a distinctive Byzantine image formula and visual aesthetic. Here, however, the execution matches both the medium and technique of the original. No doubt chosen for its poignant formulation of the idea of divine rulership in a specific dynastic constellation, the Byzantine model served its patron well to find visual expression for the idea that Christ's rule over the world works through the Ottonian imperial couple and in extension through their legitimate offspring. The visual adaptation fits well into the orbit of an imperial court and chancery that had access to a set of highly skilled artists and learned advisors who were eager to appropriate Byzantine visual formulae for specific political ends. The importance of such early and, in some respects, unique experiments is borne out in later visual adaptations of the same idea in works produced by Western artists in the scriptoria of the Reichenau, Regensburg, Fulda, and Echternach. The first readaptation of the new formula seems to occur between 1007 and 1012, namely in the frontispiece miniature of the Pericopes book of Henry II at the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek in Munich, where St. Peter and Paul introduce Henry II and his wife Kunigunde to an enthroned Christ who places crowns on their heads with female personifications representing the cities and provinces of the realm who look on from below, paying homage to Christ and the imperial couple. And I digress briefly and just show you that in 970, in this manuscript from Fulda, this coronation, the double coronation, was already adapted in a vita where it is in fact the Theotokos, it's the Virgin who crowns two female saints, this continues in other scriptoria. Here, a life of Ulrich, produced in the Reichenau from about 1020, where Ulrich himself crowns or blesses the abbots Berno of Reichenau and Friedebold of Saints Ulrich and Afra. So it's a common currency, or it becomes a common currency in the scriptoria of the empire. The longevity of the formula is attested once again some 40 years later in a gospel book made around 1050 in the scriptorium of Echternach and destined for the Collegiate Church of St. Simon and Judas in Goslar, now in the University Library of Uppsala. Here, Emperor Henry III and his wife Agnes approached the enthroned figure of Christ in a heavenly double mandola to receive their crowns from his hands in a joint act of coronation. The Latin inscription in the mandola above and below quotes Psalm 113, verse 24, the heaven of heavens is the Lord's, the earth, however, he gave to the children of man, further reinforcing Christ's divine blessing of the Salian dynasty and their imperial rule as encapsulated in the image and the inscription above. Beyond the specific iconographic formula of the double coronation, ample evidence exists for the targeted appropriation and creative reuse of Byzantine art and culture during the late Ottonian and Salian periods. Two well-known examples are the opening miniatures in Henry III's Golden Gospels for the Cathedral of Speyer in the library of the Escorial. Likewise executed in a scriptorium at Echternach, sometimes between 1043 and 1046, the full-page miniature on folio 2 verso shows Henry's parents, Conrad and Gisela, both identified with their imperial titles in accompanying inscriptions, kneeling at the feet of the enthroned Christ in an effort to kiss them. This motif is familiar, though, through another prominent monument of Ottonian art, namely the golden antependium of Basel Cathedral, which was commissioned and executed at some point during the reign of Henry II and Kunigunde, and is representing the imperial couple crouching at the feet of Christ in proskynesis and eternal adoration. While its quotation in the Golden Gospels for Speyer Cathedral seems straightforward as a direct intervisual reference, the team of artists responsible for its execution in Echternach added an interesting twist. For there can be no doubt that an excellent, likely visiting Byzantine artist worked side by side with his German peers to execute the head, hands, and feet of the enthroned Christ in an effort to add a distinct lifelike quality to the visible flesh parts of the divine figure. But not only the visual language changes in Christ's heavenly mandola, The written word surrounding the figure of Christ inside his mandola is likewise transformed, as the Latin words of Psalm 71, Benedictum nomen majestatis eius in aeternum, et replebitur majestatis eius omnis terra, are translated into Greek letters. And you can see that perhaps on the sides, on the rim of the mandola. Equally subtle interventions also characterized the manuscript's dedication page, which shows Henry III and his wife Agnes approaching the enthroned Virgin Mary, all comprised in an architectural frame that represents Speyer Cathedral. The Virgin, whose facial features and hands are once again rendered in a different, more lifelike manner, in turn accepts the gift of the Golden Gospels from the hands of Henry, with her right while crowning his wife in a swift adaptation of the familiar Byzantine coronation formula with her left. And you see that in the detail. The presence of an itinerant Byzantine artist in the scriptorium of Echternach is not only evidence for a continued openness among German rulers towards Byzantium and their affinity to its artistic products. Shortly after his own lavish imperial coronation in Rome in 1027, Emperor Conrad II is known to have sent Bishop Werner of Strasbourg and Count Manegold of Werd on a diplomatic mission to Constantinople. While the specific objective of Conrad's mission remains elusive, some scholars have argued that it may have been to secure a Byzantine bride for his son and heir Henry. Yet, even without a Byzantine bride, the Salian ruler's openness to Byzantine customs is attested by Adam of Bremen, who claims that Henry III, in a letter to Constantine Monomachos, assured the emperor that he himself was, quote, of Greek descent through Theophano and the valiant Otto, and that it was therefore not surprising that he loved the Greeks and strove to imitate them in their habits and customs, which he indeed did, end of quote. Additional material evidence for such claims may indeed be found in Conrad and Henry's coinage. A limited issue of silver denars, minted in Speyer, features a pair of bust portraits on either side of a central cross staff, in clear imitation of similar gold coins minted in Constantinople during the joint reign of Basil II and Constantine VIII. Here again, it is a poignant formula of Byzantine political iconography that struck a chord with Western rulers, eager to promote and effectively secure their own dynastic ambition. A direct knowledge of Byzantine diplomatic protocols and practices is attested for both Conrad and Henry through a number of contemporary Western sources, including one that allows us to reconstruct an act of regifting of Byzantine objects received as part of a Byzantine diplomatic mission in 1049. Thanks to Otto Kresten's hypothetical reconstruction, it can be assumed that Henry received a number of diplomatic gifts on this occasion, including precious textiles and a golden vessel, which he in turn donated to the Collegial Church of St. Simon and Judas in Goslar, where the textile was appropriated as a pala altaris and the golden vessel turned into a chalice for the celebration of the liturgy. Similar gifts of precious textiles, liturgical devotional objects, and saintly relics are attested later in the 11th century as part of Byzantine diplomatic missions to Salian emperors. According to a letter cited at length in Anna Komnene's Alexiad, Henry IV received not only 144,000 numismata and 100 silk garments from Emperor Lxxi I in an effort to convince him to take action against Robert Guiscard in southern Italy. The letter further reveals that Henry, after swearing an oath in support of the emperor's cause in Italy, would receive another 261,000 numismata and other payments. As if to stress the sincerity of the emperor's wishes, Alexios' letter concludes, quote, "For now we are sending your highness as a token of our friendship a golden pectoral cross decorated with pearls, a golden container with relics of several saints, each of which is identified by an attached note, a chalice of sardonyx, a crystal goblet, a bloodstone set in gold, and some opobalsamon," end of quote. It is difficult to assess what impact exactly such gifts had on the emperor, his family, and high-level members of the court, including leading clergymen and artists working in their immediate orbit. But the refined material and technical quality of these and other Byzantine products arriving in Germany during the 11th century cannot have failed to impress the more sophisticated members of the late Ottonian and Salian elite, if they were indeed fortunate enough to experience and handle them firsthand. Precious liturgical objects, such as the reliquary cross commissioned by Abbess Bertha for the Collegiate Church of St. Nicomedes at Borkhorst in Westphalia to enshrine a group of relics donated by Emperor Henry III, or the portable altar and altar crosses and an arm reliquary commissioned by Countess Gertrude for the Church of St. Blaise, which served as her family's memoria, give us a glimpse into the world of elite patrons during this period and allow us to appreciate the knowledge and sophistication of artists from whom secular and ecclesiastical patrons alike commissioned such artistic treasures. While these objects more indirectly betray a keen sense of the meaning of materials and the technical sophistication inherent in Byzantine art, witness, for example, the subtle application of cloisonné enamel in Gertrude's altar for St. Blaise, other works such as the cover of Bishop Bernward's precious gospel book in the Dome Museum of Hildesheim, convey an even greater awareness of the material properties and iconographic potential Byzantine objects might unfold when reframed or reappropriated to function in a local liturgical context. Commissioned sometimes during the first quarter of the 11th century and likely executed in Hildesheim, the front cover of Bernward's precious gospel book was decorated with a central panel of a close contemporary Byzantine ivory triptych, which shows the classical Byzantine formula of the dioceses, representing the Virgin and St. John the Baptist flanking a central Christ, both standing slightly elevated on footstools as they plead with him for mercy. This poignant intercessory image gained currency in Germany during the Ottonian and Salian periods. The Latin inscription, I beg you, triple power, have mercy on your servant Bernward, carved into the ivory by the donor himself or on his behalf, leaves no doubt that Bernward was keenly aware of the meaning of this pictorial formula and utilized it on behalf of his salvation. In the case of the precious Gospels, however, the donor's creative reappropriation of Byzantine works was not limited to the use of an ivory plaque, likely consciously taken out of its proper Byzantine context. For the artist who created the silver gilt back cover of the precious Gospels undoubtedly used his model for the standing Virgin, a painted or carved Byzantine icon of the Virgin Hodegetria, such as this one in Utrecht. The Greek letters appearing next to her, now jumbled as a result of a later restoration, spell out the epithet Meter Theou, Mother of God, which since the end of iconoclasm commonly identifies the Virgin as Theotokos. Nevertheless, the work is not a mere copy of its Byzantine model, for the palm branch in the Virgin's left hand can hardly be seen as anything other than a conscious Western modification. It is not until the early 12th century that we find first-hand account of ecclesiastical patrons of Bernward's caliber who attest their eagerness and interest to learn from Byzantine artists and their works, if only to compare their own artistic and aesthetic ambitions with those of the Byzantine counterparts. Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis is such a case in point, who in his Liber de Administratione Sua Gestis shares with his readers, and I quote, "I used to confer with travelers returning from Jerusalem, eager to learn from those who had seen the treasures of Constantinople and the decorations of Hagia Sophia, whether these things here were worth anything in comparison." While Suger had to rely on accounts of travelers and his own imagination to make up for the lack of direct contact with a culture that must have remained foreign, yet ultimately alluring to him, other members of the German and French episcopate and secular elite who were lucky enough to travel to Constantinople as political and ambassadors, or to Jerusalem as pious pilgrims, had the benefit of the first-hand knowledge of such luxury objects and how they functioned in the context of Byzantine liturgical celebrations and imperial ceremonies. And I'm just showing you this example here, the famous Gunther shroud in Bamberg, which was received by the Bishop of Bamberg during a pilgrimage in 1064-65, and which failed to make an impact because, of course, the body of Gunther was wrapped in it after his death and buried. So this re-emerged only in 1830 when the tomb was opened. As scholars trying to assess past experience of cultural practices and artistic encounters will rely on fragments of evidence, both written and material, that present us with a few surviving knots from a monumental tapestry of commercial, political, and cultural encounters, a tapestry torn to shreds by the passage of time and scattered by historical progress. Our efforts in reconstructing a complex past are necessarily different from those of our forebears, filtered through a different set of collective experiences and determined by our own place in the world that inherently is different from that of the Middle Ages or even of 2 centuries ago. If scholars in the 19th and early 20th centuries cast Byzantium as an Oriental other, and the generations of our teachers in the later part of the 20th century recast it as an intricate part of Europe, and we today consider it as a bridge in a global network of cultural relations between East and West, we can only wonder what impact the unfolding realities of our own time will have on future generations of art and cultural historians, and how they will answer the Byzantine question for the 11th century. As we witness the increasing fortifications of the borders at the edge of Europe, Asia, and the United States, and ponder political and cultural realignment in a number of regions across the globe, one may ask whether Byzantium ever was the bridge between worlds we today imagine it to have been, or whether this metaphor is a construct of our own wishful thinking, implying all the positive and beneficial aspects of the free flow of people, ideas, and resources, including works of art in our own global culture. Personally, I think we can and should, but with a caveat that our own position as interpreters of the past is as vulnerable to criticism as that of those generations that came before us. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Grazie molte anche per questo quadro storiografico così ampio.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this very detailed lecture. So we will have a 15-minute break and then we will resume and we will have the discussion at the end. Thank you.
sciacquato la faccia.
Riprendiamo la nostra seduta, ho il piacere di...
Let's resume. I have the pleasure of giving the floor to Saverio Martire for his lecture concerning the evolution of the relationship between sculpture and architecture in the 11th century. Before starting, I would like to thank the Cisam Foundation and all the staff. And I once again would like to congratulate them and to thank them. I try to be in line with the title. I hope I will not be too boring. These words were also uttered during the conference which was devoted to 11th century. In 5 days, he will be turning 93. He has been a constant present here in Spoleto. I will go visiting him, and if you agree, I will greet him on your behalf. I'm sure he will be very happy. The facade of Modena Cathedral might well lend itself as an emblematic example of the changing qualitative, quantitative, and functional relationships between architectural structure, sculpted decoration, and environment, in this case urban, in the transition between 11th and the 12th centuries. We might wonder, is it a starting point or an ending point? Answer this question creates, in my opinion, more problems than it solves. In fact, the founding of the cathedral on June 9th of the year 1099 seems, and in some respects it is, an eloquent event of the now decisive role that in the transition from the old to the new century, from 11th to the 12th century, sculpture has achieved a determining element in the very definition of the formal characters of an architecture, as in fact will be in the case in the centuries that follow. In the foundation slab, which is placed on the major apse of the Modenese cathedral, the architect Lanfranco is especially celebrated for his mastery in designing and directing to the highest degree the construction work. Indeed, it should not be overlooked that the reference to the quality of the stone architecture is significantly placed at the beginning of the text, where it speaks of beautiful carved marbles. And I quote in Latin. So these beautiful carved marbles constitute the most conspicuous aspect of the structure. That is what can be seen on the exterior compartments of the cathedral. It is clear that by the phrase carved marbles, it is to be understood an allusion only to the sculpture that models plant and figure elements, but also to the accurate and regular cutting of ashlars of skillfully placed square stone. This is what is the relatio about. The area of the apses and flanks of the Modenese cathedral, that is the first part to be built, actually shows an extraordinary quality in the composition of the architectural score that has in itself elements of true novelty, not so much for the shape of the pilasters, which obeys a type already widely used, formed at least by the mid-11th century, but for the entire compositional device, which has no known precedent as far as we know, but will have later imitations. Another inscription commemorating the 1099 foundation is found on the facade. Here it also appears in smaller letters at the end of the foundation text, the name of the sculptor Willigelmus, who was cited with great praise and considered worthy of honor among all sculptors. No further mention is made of the architect's fame or his work. These are the concrete reasons to believe that this inscription should be dated around the 1220s. In fact, there is a consensus among scholars today that the epigraph on the facade is evidence that the sculptor Viligelmo had by then taken control of the building site in which Lanfranco was most likely no longer present. The inclusion of a high coefficient of sculptural elements on the Modena facade is an event that, in a sense, revolutionized Lanfranco's design. We may ask whether the new architectural appearance of the facade represented an innovation in the Modena building site, because it introduced, admittedly, with a generous dosage, an element, sculpture, previously possibly not included in Lanfranco's design. Yet, if we think of the device of the architectural system that wraps around the entire perimeter of the building, in the apses and minor aisles, with pilasters in the form of composite half pillars arising from the basing wainscoting of the structure, it is not difficult to imagine that at least the presence of capitals was planned as a logical solution for the completion of the system. Did Lanfranco envision a greater weight for the facade to be given to the sculpture, or did Viligelmo's intervention and Lanfranco's contextual oblivion really represent a turning point? It is likely that this second point of view is the good one. In any case, there is no doubt that the sculpted facade of Modena rightfully joins the series of examples from the early 12th century representing the establishment of the type of the sculpted front of a church. And we can cite, for example, Angoulême or Notre-Dame-la-Grande in Poitiers, where the path of formation of a facade screen sets the stage for very mature and articulate realizations, such as the cases of San Michele in Pavia, or a little later, St. Mary of Ripoll or Regensburg, or again, the facades of the two churches of St. Peter's in Tuscany and Spoleto. In any case, what we have so far factored is necessarily suggests that there was an evolutionary path that matured in the 11th century. However, any attempt to trace the stages of such a path presents us a number of often insurmountable obstacles, since we have to reckon with the balance between what remains today and the amount, which must be considerable, of what has been lost. Added to these are always a series of unknowns about the chronological datum, since depending on the context, which stylistic criticism would indicate as archaic traits can often turn out to be the result of late executions, and vice versa. Finally, reconnaissance of even part of the endless number of interventions in the specialist literature of the last century indicates the variety and multidirectionality of production in the century with which we are concerned these days. Concerning the development of a new mode of interaction between architecture and sculpture, with respect to the centuries of the early Middle Age, much has been exercised, in particular by French historiography, and we would say by reflex, that of the Iberian Peninsula, because of certain undoubted formal affinities, and because of the finding of some of the most significant examples of these testimonies in the area from the southwest of France to Aragon. In particularly, the art that we call the Romanesque, and which, especially at the beginning of the last century, began to revolve around the concept of premier art roman, or in Catalan, premier art romanic, in the words of Cadafalch, who is credited with the authorship of this definition. In Italian studies, the term proto-Romanic, with identical meaning, whether we like it or not, this definition has become of common use in the field of studies, tends to introduce and confirm the notion of the innovative role of artistic manifestations in the 11th century from its beginnings. Now, given that the snow white mantle of churches that would cover Europe after the year 1000, in the words of Rudolf de Glaber, only a quantitatively undefinable, and in any case meager fraction remains today, we might also think that the splendor was given in the eyes of the chronicler by the novelties these churches displayed. I would not go that far, however. I wouldn't say so concerning Rodolphus Glabrus. As we can see, the historical picture is confirmed by to be absolutely unclear and non-linear. In fact, as it has been repeatedly pointing out, any kind of typological synthesis, or let us say better, definition of architectural and artistic typologies fails in the face of the realization that each context is a case in itself and responds to motivation, needs, even fortuitous occurrences, which can hardly ever be harnessed into generalization of any kind. Added to this fact, is the fact, as it has been amply shown in the more shrewd critical literature, that as early as the 10th century, some of those elements of novelty in architecture and in sculpture began to be discerned that define the term itself, like it or not, precisely as premier armement. These innovations were already recalled by Luis Grodecki in his successful book, Ottonian Architecture. Think about the suggestive definition between mur and paroi, indicating by this apparent synonymous pair the fundamental difference between wall structure proper and surface treatment of it for decorative purposes. This resulted in decorative scores that tended to interrupt the continuity of the exterior masonry that had been characteristic, though not exclusive, of late antique architecture, and that the builders of the early Middle Ages had declined by modulating the walls through narrow arches entirely devoid of structural functions. The wall scores that took hold between the 10th and 11th centuries constituted a development and geographical expansion from Italy to Catalonia, France, and the northern territories of the Ottonian Empire of that decorative system, which was further fractioned into variable systems of tin, pilasters, and arches, significantly called the Bande Lombarde. We should remember, though, that Adriano Peroni has pointed out how, in addition to these, quite a few other elements characterize the architectural innovations. For example, the fractionation and modulation of internal volumes and the creation of support systems that go beyond, for various reasons, the paradigm of the column of ancient derivation in function of the creation of supports with an articulated profile formed by the union of different elements with rectilinear and circular sections to form the composite pillars. Along with them, the formulation of vaulted roof of certain width. These elements added together can be resolved by a formula, perhaps too simplistic but nonetheless effective, the notion of plasticism, which in certain terms had been partly anticipated by Luis Grodecki, who saw the signs of the innovation brought by Ottonian architecture in the articulation of juxtaposed space to overcoming of the traditional structure, especially of the column basilica of late antique tradition, which continue to survive in the example of the so-called Southern Romanesque, especially in Italy. That said, precisely the connotation of plasticism with which the architectural structure of religious buildings between the 10th and the 11th centuries considered the element that stimulated a new relationship between architecture and decoration. Limiting this to sculpture, we observe that the latter was able to take advantage of this spatial fragmentation by somehow conquering the spaces left vacant by painting or even new spaces. We speak, of course, in general sense, and we could almost say theoretical, since the examination of the different sculptural complexes confronts us with an extremely variable casuistry, which, we repeat, cannot be traced back either in typologies or even in the notion of phantom, formal, or even less stylistic currents. The French specialist historiography, to which we give credit for having endeavored to systematize the approach to the multifaceted phase of early Romanesque art in France and Europe, has considered, I think rightly, the development of the plastic and aesthetic dimensions in the architecture of this period as a kind of stimulating mechanisms for the new functions that sculpture was about to perform and the role it was preparing to play throughout the 11th century. Reading some of those texts, and I cite them here, the seminal contributions of Marcel Durlia, Jean Cabanon, and Eliane Vergnol, one perceives a strong classificatory approach in the investigation of the earliest evidence of sculpted decoration applied to architecture, and almost a desire to recognize the primacy of France over other territories in the elaboration of a new role for sculpture that would add to, and indeed surpasses, the simple Lombard tendency to decorate, initially by the means of architecture alone, the exterior walls of buildings, and particularly religious ones. In this path, we have seen a gradual establishment of what the same French historiography, with a nice term called essor de la sculpture monumentale. Now, monumental sculpture, that is sculpture inextricably linked to architectural structure, and which German scholars call Bauskulptur, it's not an invention of the 11th century. Throughout the early Middle Ages, the contribution made by sculpture to architecture, and here we refer especially to religious architecture, since it accounts for all the preserved examples. On the one hand, it was a necessary function if we think of the capitals as structural components, and at the same time, from classical antiquity, determinant elements of the architectural lexicon. On the other, we have to think about the defining value, so to speak, for architecture itself, represented by the endless series of plutei, transepts, pilasters, pergole, ciboriums that for a long time have represented those components of the furnishings that define the space and the functions assigned to it. The renewal of monumental sculpture that takes place in the 11th century reinterprets with greater or lesser degree of inventiveness the traditional functions of plastic decoration in architecture, while remaining room, of course, for continuity in the use of functional furnishings for liturgy and devotion. The French series constitute the best-known heritage of this production, if only because of the amount of studies produced with sweeping surveys, and one would struggle to find elsewhere, even in Italy, such a number of examples, moreover provided with rather reliable chronological footholds, although constantly the subject of debate. Even just a roundup of some of the evidence from a vast and heterogeneous repertoire would require space and time that we do not have at our disposal. It being understood that we are trying to make some, albeit quick, observations, above all on the role that in the 11th century sculpture assumes, above all, in redefining the external appearance of buildings. Let it suffice to mention here that from what we can understand, most of the evolutionary trends in sculpture between the 10th and 11th century concern the plastic development of the capital and its various formulations and functions. On the one hand, the reflection of the ancient Corinthian capital began already in the Carolingian age with that type of Eliane Vergnol is called the corytisant, giving rise to a very high series of variants that will continue throughout the century and beyond. We see, however, quite early on the emergence of a real revival of the ancient Corinthian capital. The most striking example of what appears to be an assimilation rather than an imitation, it's introducing a comparison that aspires to put the new products on a par, if not in competition, with the ancient models, is found in the Tour Porche or Tower Gate of Saint-Benoît-sur-Loire. The structural block began to be built within the 4th decade of the 11th century to the west of the important Abbey Church. Was commissioned by Abbot Gozlan, who wanted to have a tower built ex quadris lapidibus, such that it would be an example to all Gaul, has recounted in his life, written by Andrew Fleury. The group of capitals on the ground floor is on the hall to the atelier of Almagister Umbertus, who not coincidentally affixes his signature precisely on a magnificent imitation capital. This is important. This classicist approach is evident in a sheet with drawings of plant elements in the old-fashioned style contained in the Reginense Latin Vatican Codex, believed to have come right from Saint-Benoît-sur-Loire. The only variation from the ancient models is the fact that here we are in the presence of half capitals. This may seem an insignificant fact, but in fact it is one of the most innovative aspects, since the semi-capital lends itself, by its implicit nature, as a sub-multiple to a modular function. This notion implies the conscious abandonment, from a conceptual point of view, of the unity that characterizes ancient production, and paves the way for the possibility of segmentation and recomposition that allow for rapid, we would say, automatic adaptation to the multiple transformation, in particularly in the transition to the Romanesque. The resulting sense of varietas represents one of the characteristics, data of decoration, that from the art of the beginning of the 11th century will be transmitted to Romanesque. After the magnificent capitals of Saint-Benoît-Abbé, we will find this willingness to retrace ancient models in other French examples up to the second half of the 11th century. But the element of varietas will really come up again in a crucial way when the innovation of figure and then historiated capitals is introduced, a true Romanesque invention, as Eliane Vergnol has argued. Textbook examples are now the capitals of what remains of the Rotunda of Saint-Benigno in Dijon, but the Italian abbot William of Volpiano, or some of the figure capitals of the crypt of Saint-Aignan in Orléans, Saint-Germain-des-Prés in Paris. Returning to the two porches of Saint-Benoît, the sense of varietas and the assortment of capitals does not allow to define at this stage a unified iconographic program. The type of the figure, and especially historiated capital, will find increasingly elaborate application towards the end of the century. The conscious establishment of the varied assortment of capitals as a standard element, if not actually a rule, for the arrangement at the design and site stage of a series of capitals to be placed inside and outside the building, is another fundamental aesthetic feature that the sculpture of the 11th century gives to the art of the later period. This is a product of the fact that the natural heterogeneity of the types of reused capitals, which in the early Middle Ages no longer allowed for homogeneous sets of pieces, as had been the case in many examples from late antiquity, progressively induced pourcause, as for example in Santa Sabina in Rome. This provided a new aesthetic that we could be found again when during the 11th century buildings were provided with new, especially made capitals. This aesthetic was to remain for a long time until it was essentially abandoned in the 13th century, although it should be mentioned, for the sake of truth, that the carved interior decoration, especially the use of both leaf and historiated capitals, was not a rule. A good number of 11th and 12th century buildings scattered throughout Europe did without it. I will not proceed further either on casuistics, different cases are on this subject, because it would take us outside the topic of this lecture. Likewise, let's now concentrate in examining how the Renaissance of the 11th century of monumental sculpture is explored by bringing back, after very many centuries, sculpture to the exterior of buildings as well, producing one of the most strikingly innovative features. To do this, let's go back for a moment to the great tour porche of Saint-Benoît-sur-Loire. One will notice that although is normally observed in a church, the spaces in which the capitals themselves converse with each other and with the observer, so to speak, are narrower, more compressed. The fact is that here we are not inside a church, but outside, to be precise, in front of the church. In concrete terms, in short, the structure, which appears as a kind of triumphal arch on two levels, prepares the entrance by offering itself in a way that we would say is transparent to the outside view. In addition to this open-air display of the sculptural apparatus of the capitals, to show the extent of this deliberate intervention in the extrinsication of decorative, but above all narrative and doctrinal aspects on the north wall of the tour porch, perhaps originally on the other sides as well, there are curved slabs in relief arranged at various points in the masonry without any real intent to orchestrate the whole. The best readable sculptures represent human and animal figures that have been traced to imitation of Gallo-Roman and Merovingian terracotta reliefs, and therefore these are not real spolia walled into the wall of the tour porch, but pseudo-spolia. On one of the pillars on the upper floor, on the other hand, is placed on two framed slabs, actually made up of 6 stone blocks, the depiction of the stoning of Saint Stephen. This type of slabs are placed mainly on facades and are found during the 11th century in several examples in various areas of France. Henri Faucillon has noted how at an early stage there was no particular attention paid to the placement of these reliefs in coordinated series, as seen precisely in his definition of the loi du cadre, that is, their elastic, as it were, adaptation of the representation to the shape and proportions of the stone block, whether capital, element, or slab. For England, an extremely fragmentary series of mostly exterior building decoration has been studied, for which the 7th century dates and comparisons with the Eastern Mediterranean area have also been proposed. In addition, evidence from the Liber Vitae of Winchester reports of the series of figures featuring Christ, the Virgin, St. Michael, and other saints placed on the walls of the 5-story facade tower of Newminster built by King Ethelred between 980 and 983. To this lost example, for which only ideal reconstructions can be restored to, chronologically, because of its geographical continuity with Winchester, and thus to be considered possibly a reflection of the Newminster Tower, the large crucifixion port above the portal, by its own account of very simple form, of the chapel of Headbourne Worthy. These examples were all referring to the period of the Revolution of Chrome. We could compare this with the facade of San Pantaleon in Cologne, where in the early 11th century, and for some studies even a little earlier, now stucco figures were applied, now preserved in a few erratic fragments. The case of the expansion of sculpture on the exterior of some 11th century buildings, especially in the Loire Valley, the subject of Eliane Vergnol, allow us to grasp the evolution of this type of plastic decoration of architecture from simple composition, both in iconographic content and in realization, to gradually better structured ensemble with series of figures or scenes, preferably applied to the front of buildings and sometimes accompanied by special care and decorative in the proper sense in the laying of wall surfaces. These are realizations that are not necessarily interrelated, each, of course, originated from its own motivations and aspirations, but the whole can give an idea of the degree of progressive enrichment of the church's external compartments. There are a number of cases, all of which can be placed in the second half of the 11th century, of Beaulieu-les-Loches, Saint-Symphorien, Azay-les-Rideaux, etc. And I point out for Italy, although not comparable except ideally to the French examples, a series of examples recently studied by Viscione that show a similar aptitude in wall decoration through the addition of decorative or more rarely figured tiles in a series of churches between Tuscany and Abruzzo. Sometimes specially executed and sometimes with spolia of ancient and early medieval material, or pseudo-spolia, imitation sculptures, somewhat reminiscent of the French examples in the series of panels on the facade of the Pieve di Brancoli in the province of Lucca. In territories where stone was scarce, the Great Po Valley, for example, the decorative coefficient of the exterior surfaces was entrusted to brick. Also in combination, stone and marble elements are either spoglio or especially executed. The most famous one is the portico of the Pomposa Abbey Church, built perhaps around the 1130 by Magister Masulo, whose name is recorded in a marble inscription placed immediately to the right of the entrance arch. The colleague showed earlier the picture of that precise part. The decoration of the wall relies on the coordinated combination of brick elements of two different colors, forming portions of the facing, framing circular openings and bands with plant shoots inhabited by animal and human figures, arranged on straight bands on the arches and on the two crosses. Added are brick and marble tiles with animals, open-work marble elements, and finally ancient and early medieval spolia. The repertoire recalls several examples with decorative terracotta bands in the upper Adriatic area, traceable in several cases in that geographic area as far as Venice. Similar decorations are found at a somewhat later date on the great bell tower of Pomposa Abbey, began by the Magister Deusedit in 1063, as recalled by an inscription on marble in large capital letters of classical type. Vegetable bands in terracotta mark the cornices between the outer shelves of the structure, as was the case earlier on the bell tower of the Basilica of San Michele in Pavia, a structure much older than the Romanesque basilica and related to the pre-existing building. So these bricks are not printed, but they are carved. Let us now return to the Loire Valley that look at the frieze
che ho eliminato, non ci torniamo, insomma, a S13 ho perduto la diapositiva, diciamo un fregio sulle absidi e ci...
So there is a frieze on the apsides, and we have to wonder why it is there rather than on the facade. The reason for this choice is in the criteria of maximum visibility, and so the rich decoration marked the sacred place in a place along a path of approach to the church that must have been quite busy. So the front of a church doesn't have correspondence only with the main facade, the one with the portal, whether facing west or in other directions, nor even when there are several portals. In addition to these important parts of the structure, any part that makes clear the presence of the sacred place and attracts towards it lends itself to serve as the front, or rather the frontispiece. Willy Barsauerlander spoke about a parallel with what today is the show business. So a case in my point, very important from this point of view, is the exterior of the central area of the monastic Basilica of Santa Bondio in Como, rebuilt from about 1020 after the installation of a community to establish the monastery, and consecrated in 1095 by Urban II. The richness of the double-row window frames, compared to some windows of the Spear Cathedral, represents the part of the building that was immediately visible. It's a sober facade, and so this is the and so it is a part which is visible to those approaching the basilica from the city. Proof of this is that the windows that do not offer themselves to view from the road to the public are not decorated. Now let's see the problem of porters, a crucial place, optical, conceptual, and functional junction. That of the striated portal is considered an invention essentially of the 11th century, although it should be remembered that figured and particularly narrative elements have been present on the facades of buildings from late antiquity onwards. Suffice it to think of the wooden doors of Sant'Ambrogio in Milan or Santa Sabina in Rome, the 5th century, or with a chronological leap that takes us to the 11th century, the heavy striated doors of the bronze door commissioned by Bishop Bernard of Hildesheim, or the wooden door with stories of Christ in the Basilica of Santa Maria in Capitol in Cologne, all examples of a figurative tradition that was widespread as early as late antiquity and aimed to optically polarize access to the church. For a long time, the portal retained its architrived form, often lacking any decorative connotations of its own other than those proper to the ancient architectural lexicon. Examples of this type in the 11th century include the richly ornamented portals of the Syrian Basilica of Monte Cassino, later echoed in a less lavish form, but with the addition of an archivolt by those of Sant'Angelo in Formis and Salerno Cathedral, which still frames the original bronze portal and has two lions in relief at the base of the carved jumps decorated with plant shoots. In Aversa Cathedral, the major portal has been dismembered and only two elements of the jumps remain, now preserved in an erratic form and dating from the middle of the century, decorated with the fanciful depictions. So there is this portal which was supposed to be a lateral door of the facade. It has two small masks under the arch. The arched portal form, with and without lintels, has become more widespread in more recent times, but at least since the early Middle Ages, and sometimes with the ends of ancient triumphal arches. Great prominence is rightly given to the portals of Roussillon, Saint-Genis-de-Fontaine, Saint-André-de-Sorède, and in lesser measure, Arles-sur-Stèque, as very precocious examples of the manifestation of sculpture outside buildings of worship. The dating that is unanimously attributed to these three cases, all located in localities around Perpignan and only a few kilometers apart, is based on the chronological coordinates given by the inscription on the lintel of Saint-Genis-de-Fontaine, which dates to 1019 and places this portal as a progenitor of the other two. The notoriety of the three Roussillonese portals exempts me, mainly for reasons of space-time, from illustrating their constituent elements. Despite their undoubted importance for the earliness of their manifestation, these examples in marginal areas do not seem to me to mark a starting point. Perhaps epicons or precedents that have not come down to us, they do not constitute the beginning of an ongoing process of enrichment of portal structures, which would not occur until the second half, and even more so towards the end of the century. In a recent study of these portals, Alessia Trivellone has rightly proposed to see in this gradual expansion of sculpture outwards the change of the ritual consecration of churches, which just from the 10th, 11th centuries begins to include also the outer walls of the building and the external extension of the protected space of the church, the so-called segrete. While in the second half of the 11th century, will it be possible to measure an increasing importance attributed to the portal, first integration and then more and more explicitly in iconographic content, which will transform the structural element into a fundamental junction at once optical and doctrinal. There is no doubt that such a development has been affected by the role that the portal is progressively called upon to play as a paradigm in synthesis, even a striking one, of the importance that architecture, particularly religious architecture, gradually comes to play as a determinant element of public space, an importance that, of course, is intended first and foremost to mirror spiritual authority and eventually political and economic authority. The development of the great Romanesque portal starts from the progressive enrichment of its structural elements, and especially through the multiplication of profiles. The portal of the transept of the Abbey of Saint-Foy-en-Conques and the Port de Comte of the pilgrimage Basilica of Sarreguemines by the 1190s are considered among the earliest examples of portals, so-called aboussures, and we will say multiple coordinate, a process that in fact amplifies the importance of access or entrances to the church from the point of view not only of structure but also of optics, and for the same reason, symbolism, which will become doctrinaire when in the mature Romanesque and later Gothic the profiles will accommodate statues, columns, and figurations. For Italy, I just mentioned that a few cases lend themselves to illustrate this development. For example, the portal of the Basilica of Santa Bonde in Como, which perhaps predates by a few years the 1095 consecration by Urban II, constitutes an early example of a coordinated portal with ornate elements which are unfinished in the major archivolt that constitutes the only sculpted element of an otherwise extremely sober facade. In Lombardy, the common example will have Venico as early as the first quarter of the 12th century in examples of rank such as Sant'Ambrogio in Milan or San Michele in Pavia. In the figural and symbolic doctrinal device of the portal, the issue of carved tympanums deserves a mention. The problem of the birth and chronological precedence of this element now involves temporal coordinates projected to the 12th century. And there are several precedents in painting and already in early Middle Age. So, precedence was given to the tympanum of the west portal of the cathedral in Jaca, Aragon, dated to about 1090. Depicted there is a lion Christ with an allusion to the salvation of the repentant sinner and the damnation of the impenitent. Without further comment, we can only observe how in this case we're dealing with a transposition into images of a doctrinal theme, following an approach that will triumph in the first quarter of the 12th century, magnificent in the famous tympanums of Mossai, Conques, Vézelay, Autun, and others. In Italy, the season of carved tympanums, however, will take place around the middle of the century, although some Tuscan examples considered minor, which I will illustrate in the proceedings, may change the perspective, at least chronologically. Now, in conclusion, let's go back to the facade of Modena Cathedral. It is taken as a pretext, and I make the mistake of considering paradigmatic. It seems to me that somehow now we can attempt to give a first tentative answer to the initial question, the novelties of which the modernist work site is the bearer constitute a turning point, at least in the artistic culture of northwestern Italy, but with the possible attentions to the Aquitanic and Burgundian areas sometimes indicated by the critics. Yet such novelties show as the fruit of a series of research, even convoluted, multiform and multifocal, that the 11th century Europe was able to put in place even in the field of artistic and architectural production. As with other areas of research, even in aspects of art, therefore, the long 11th century, as it was defined again the other day by Michelangelo da Cunto and today by the colleague Klein, shows itself with many workshops, even unaware of many conflicting orientations, so that even in this case it is impossible to try to define unambiguous, let alone coordinated lines of development. However, even for the aspects we tried to outline, the 11th century confirmed itself as a time of change, sometimes gradual but often sudden and radical. In between two epochs, perhaps even more than the previous century, it set the stage for the era that we call Romanesque. Thank you.
Grazie per questa bella lezione.
Thank you for this lecture, which has given us a lot of important information. So now we start the discussion. I remind you we have to finish by 12:15. So I'd like to ask the other speakers to join me here. And I ask you to summarize your questions, so to ask brief questions so that everybody can participate in the discussion. Okay, so we can start. So we can open the discussion on the lecture by Professor Somma. Are there questions, remarks? Maybe I asked too much when I asked you to be brief, but we have some time.
Grazie, ti ho già ringraziato, ma lo faccio ancora. Sono temi che mi interessano.
Thank you so much. These topics are very interesting to me. I worked on these aspects, on the marches, and there was a point when you said that a French call it marche lapidaire. So these have different values.
Di Modena, ma anche sul castello.
I studied some of them in Modena, in the Castle of Pavia, and also in the Tower of Pisa. So they have a value for the assembly, so they have a number and correspondence, and others were used to identify the masters that executed them. So have you noticed some things that can give us an idea on this use, if there is there are numbers, etc., and then those who said the work were not the ones who were actually making the work. Yes, there is a distinction which I combined because of the time. Of course, there are two macro categories on the lapidary signs, and the ones concerning the organization of the construction site, because the need to put these signs means that those who prepare the piece have to give indications to those who actually place them. And I showed you the case of Corfilio. So in that case, there are blocks of the apps which are numbered by rows, and so then there is all the issue concerning the workers, and of course this has a consequence in the site, because it means that maybe, especially in the big complexes, several teams of workers used to operate, and so at the level of site organization this had an impact, and specified that that piece was made by a specific master, etc. So from this point of view, the answer is yes. And I can say that those who actually install the pieces, we don't see them, and the other ones are seen. And so there is a functional aspect. So we find the others because they are well declared. So if we look at the church in Munich, there is an architect who has as his own symbol. So his career from a simple worker to a master, and his coat of arms is that specific symbol. Yes, for these chronologies we are dealing with, these are the only evidence that we have. Do you have other questions? Please.
Ci sono altre domande sulla...
Do you have other questions on the lecture by Professor Somma?
I hope you don't mind my asking in English, but I was wondering whether there are any, it's basically a question about the local versus the regional, and the evidence in the sources, whether there is workshops in the south of Italy that can be identified as having come from elsewhere, either from the Byzantine Empire or from further north. How do the written sources tell us anything about this? For Venice, for example, we have the imputation of some workmen who were active in an earlier period, but is there any evidence of this kind of relationship with the empire in that respect?
Diciamo che dal punto di vista delle fonti, le scritte abbiamo pochissime.
From the point of view of written sources, we don't have much. So we have these correspondences from a material point of view. Then, of course, there are some specific situations which are not specific sources on the building. Maybe within the context, we can see an intervention in that context, and then we try to compare it with the material datum, but in most cases, no. Do you have other questions? Well, so we can move on and discuss the lecture by Professor Klein. Do you have questions for him? Please.
Für den Vortrag. Sie haben nach der historiografischen Debatte.
I'm sorry, there is no translation from German.
Gibt es irgendwelche Reflexe in Byzanz auf die westliche Kultur?
I'll answer in English for the benefit of the translation. The question was whether there are any reflexes or the indication of any impact in the Eastern Empire on the West. And the question here is unfortunately a resounding no to perhaps some. I mentioned the idea that we have that Byzantium is a bridge to the West, and one would assume that a bridge goes both ways. But in the sense that there is an impact artistically of Western art in Byzantium, I would say one has to look at the border regions. One has to look at the fringes of the Byzantine Empire to discover, on the basis of specific works of art, that there are indications of Western as having an impact. I'm thinking of Croatia, I'm thinking of the Balkans, and other places. The focus that I had on the imperial actors and their immediate environment, I would say that there is not a critical indication that there is a positive response. So Byzantium probably would not have considered it a bridge to the West to go the other way. But in instances where we have, for example, the records of diplomatic missions going one way or the other, there are some interesting references where we see in the gifts that Westerners bring to Byzantium, swords, sort of particular techniques that might have been appreciated, but not in the same way. Peter Schreiner has focused on some of those sources that tell us about what Westerners brought. But do we see a vibrant impact of Western artifacts in Byzantium at the court of the Byzantine Empire? I would have to think hard to find a single one.
Grazie.
Thank you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that and the closer. Okay, thank you. Within the framework of the local global, can you comment at all on the ways that the Ottonian and Salian courts and ecclesiastical foundations would have acted as a bridge in the other direction, further west and north of Byzantine art and culture, and did that become a part of their cultural capital within the Latin sphere?
That's an interesting question. I would have to think a little bit more about sort of the role of the empire as a mediator to parts further west or even north. One would probably have to look at marriages. I think we've just discussed before the break the question of how England is part of that system of dynastic alliances. And in the later period, if you look at the 12th century, for Henry the Lion, we have some evidence of sort of infusion of the North with elements that came through the empire through his marriage into the Plantagenet court. But the question in earlier periods is a good one, and I have to say that I don't know that material as well as I perhaps should, whether there is any impact in the North, in England in particular, but perhaps also further west, of such a mediation function, that the empire functions as a bridge in some respects. So let me think about that a little bit longer. Thank you.
Marvelous an exposition also. I have a question, actually a little bit in line of the other two, but you showed us the problems of historiography, and historiography normally, especially of a German side. How is it with the Greek and perhaps even further the Eastern European or Arabic historiography? Can you see there a kind of evolution in the Byzantine question?
That was a question I feared because I very much focused on the German material. You're absolutely right, and at the beginning of the discipline of art history, because that was a crucial time when questions of schools were discussed, right? So especially the early 19th century, when this is a debate that begins in antiquarian circles and then is taken up from the middle to the second part of the 19th century by people who are also art historians of the first generation, I would say, but who are coming out of a environment. Hegel is a very critical figure in Berlin at that time, with people who are not trained art historians, but who are coming out of that antiquarian tradition. I don't know, and I have not looked specifically in the national literatures that develop. Would be fruitful to do that, in fact, to see what the response is to this question, whether it poses itself in the same way. I think in Germany it is, particularly with regard to the Baukunst, always something that is, perhaps Werner Jacobsen can talk about this more, but there is a sense that first one has to make sense of the nomenclature, and that is really part of that early debate. When it comes to the formation of national schools of art history, I would think that there are different. There's a different focus if you look at France, or if you look at, for instance, Russia. Very clearly, if you look at the eastern route, you would find a very sort of specific interest in creating linkages with that Byzantine past, and that is often done. I have not looked specifically into the early formation of that, but in Russian literature, of course, there is this sort of heritage that is being carried north. In the West, I have not focused on the French tradition, which is also one that is focusing on style particularly. But it's an adaptation to actually look and perhaps do a comparative analysis of that in a European context. Thank you.
Bene, grazie. Non mi sembra ci siano altre richieste di...
Thank you. I don't see any other questions, so thank you. And let's now move on to the lecture by Professor Lo Martire. I don't know if there's any question.
Ciao, prima di tutto un piacere di salutarti.
Hi, good morning. First and foremost, we have been writing each other in this last month to talk about the Basilica of Sant'Abbondio. And I came here today because I really wanted to meet Saverio, since we haven't seen each other since the exhibitions of the Longobards. Not only that, I also must confess a sin that I made, because I dealt with the language of early medieval times, and I took the definition by Josephi as an enlightening one in a book concerning the sculpture in Friuli, and the themes, the topics, and the images were responding to a type of culture that was denying that if we had met the pieces belonging to liturgical stones, for example, we might be facing pieces of different ages brought together in one monument for economic reasons. When, after Metz, the research by Sennhauser was published, well, at that point, 1,300 fragments, which equaled more or less 260 stones of a royal abbey funded by Charlemagne before or around 774, couldn't be considered any longer as pieces collected, par hasard or by chance. So this is first and foremost my apologies to Saverio, because I kept on to use this culture and this approach, and therefore I went to look up at the bibliography, and I found out that in the volume that Saverio wrote concerning the fall of the Longobards, had defined the principle of the varietas. If I can read, do we have the time? I don't know how long it is, but the zoomorphological elements is combined to the tree of life. And so analyzing the theme, the topics in the early medieval sculpture, Saverio was calling this system of the varietas, which pairs with what I said earlier. So this morning, I'm here, and once again, I hear this talk about varietas, and what strikes me that in the structures of end of 11th, beginning of 12th century, this varietas is also built on purpose. I mean, because some pseudo spolia are used. So the varietas is the declaratio of a cultural polysemy that at the time it was also a political polysemy. So a political approach. And again, this morning I learned something that I would have never get to know. So I would like to thank Saverio, and thanks because, again, you have provided a new element of knowledge. Thank you. I don't know what to answer. That, first of all, you shouldn't have come here, and second, because it's an honor for me. I'm a little bit embarrassed, to be honest, but thank you. I don't have... I can't grasp the nuances, refined nuances that you have mentioned, because I'm more of an artisan and aspiring historian of art. And what I say is what I learned, that you learn from things. I would never teach architecture or somebody else to teach what a piece of stone is. So again, just talking about the capitals, if I build Santa Sabina, for example, I need 28 columns, 28 capitals. I find them all the same, and I find the standardization. And I find them in Rome. If I'm in a different city, I struggle a little bit. Given the lives of the abbots and the bishops, we know how much did they struggle, and they were really trying, looking for different columns and different capitals, going in different cities, looking for those pieces. Actually, in some cases, we have Charlemagne bringing columns or marbles from Rome. He even wanted a wolf, but they couldn't find one, and they took another type of animal. Charlemagne was struggling. He had difficulties in find the different type of capitals. So, thinking about San Salvatore of Spoleto and San Salvatore of Brescia, we are roughly in the 980. They wanted to build a basilica on the columns. They don't have enough columns. They don't have capital. So this is why they changed slightly. Column actually is, more precious, let's say, compared to the capitals, if I have to be honest. This means that there was a need, and this varietas, was born out of a necessity. Second half of the 12th and 3rd century, they went back to the Ordo. I'm making now a clear example. Notre Dame, 2 or 3 capitals, they are all the same. There was a moment when this was pour cause, and then it did change the aesthetics. So they decided to have different ones because it looked better. In the end, he uses this term, but I don't know, maybe I have invented it, because varietas is a rhetorical figure. When I talk through the capitals that want to, because if I want Corinthian capitals, it's because I want them to be Corinthian. Or if I want stone capitals, which are actually huge, I'm looking for them. But even if they made them on purpose, they didn't do them all the same. If you go to the Duomo in Pisa, these capitals are all different from one another. They believed to be ancient, but no, they were actually made on purpose. So the aesthetic changes, which is when the planification changes according to the varietas. We then have elements, figurative or narrative, and the varietas, to this extent, allow us to go back to the semantic, which is the rhetoric. That's it, which is why varietas seems to me a better choice. Thank you.
Speriamo di non mi mettere in difficoltà.
Allora, grazie a tutti e tre i relatori innanzitutto perché da...
Well, thank to all the three lecturers, because as an historian of art, finally, I was really into your lectures. I wanted to ask Professor Lo Martire, thank you for the very interesting presentation. My question is mainly on an example you made, which is that of Pomposa. On the basis of personal studies, I have been dealing with these so-called lagoon style Ravenna, which, as you rightly said, brings together the area of Pomposa and Venice, Torricello. Pieces have been also found in Croatia, in the Quarnero, and in Zadar. In a museum, there are some pieces. And you also rightly mentioned the bell tower of Venice. And if I remember well, in our article, the style and the decorations of the bell tower of Pavia was similar to the previous one in Pomposa, proposing then as a mediator between Milan, where we find some examples of this decoration, and the Adriatic area. Since concerning the lagoon and Ravenna lagoon style, there are several hypotheses concerning the origins. What I was wondering is, how do you interact with this issue? And because it seems to me that the most convincing hypothesis is the Peroni one, which is to say that it's a type of Padana decoration from Padania. Apparently, what is said that it started from Torricello and then eventually was found in San Marco. This is not what I'm really interested into. I just wanted to ask, how do you consider this issue? Because in the last years, a lot has been said, and it seems to be Adriatic core. Is it something that... Well, very complex question, to be honest. You have talked about Peroni, who is, my teacher, but not because I have to... I don't have to tell that he was right because he was my teacher, but I start by saying that Georgia, Armenia, they have architecture that have some features of, but we must verify whether the dates are correct. I mentioned the Dome of Modena because 1099, 9th of June, first slab was laid, and even a part of 5 meters up should, let us understand more or less in what time are we talking about. Another thing to consider is that we must be a little bit flexible, because when there is a construction, a building site, usually sometimes these building sites last for several years, and maybe they also change over time. So when we're talking about Eastern, exception made for very exceptional cases, which have been proved by, this morning, showing and thinking that everything comes from there, it's easy somehow. It's true that the Adriatic area is the one that has more relations with those areas. In this case, we are talking about objects which were created on the basis of materials which were available in those areas, and something else. Peroni also, in another book, he mentioned the bell tower of Pavia of the 11th century, or maybe even earlier, but in a private collection in a garden belonging to two brothers, there are some very similar fragments to the ones in Pomposa. It comes from the Church of Sant'Apollinare. So there must have been some contacts. If the origin is Pavia, I'm not sure, but Pavia is an apax, to use a rhetorical term. And not only, the bell tower in Pavia had the different features on the two different sides. The Romanesque part was lining on the bell tower, so we're not sure. But it's not just that. Little windows, there also has some decorations. The plaster also was saving some frames around the window. It was a very complex structure. The same happened in Pomposa, where we have different type of brickworks. I wouldn't use the category of the derivation, but there are there. So the context between Pavia, which at the time was the capital much more than it would have become later, those were the years where the kings actually live in Pavia. In 1024, no, because Frederick II dies, and the city was still involved, but this is just to say that it was a place where there was a constant flow of contacts and of passages. So there was a document, Honorates Civitas Papier, that was destined to issue outside the palace, so in white marble. And in this document, it is stated that the Venetians, for example, had to pay their tribute by offering, from time to time, a ship with a house on top, and because one for the king and one for the queen, which were anchored in the area. Also the big market, which was just outside the palace, where there were textiles being sold, etc. As Cinzio Velante said, they were paying also for mooring the ships. So it was just like around the area of Comacchio, slightly different where they are now. But at the time there was a trade going on. They were moving to Cremona. They had their personal mooring because they were using the Po River to go from Pavia to Cremona. And they had to pay a certain amount of money. This is just to give you an idea about the network that can put these two realities, these two areas in context without going far to in Georgia or Armenia. Clearly, we have documents which maybe are not definitive one. I mean, clearly, as for the blue, this was coming from Eastern countries. But we have to prove, basically, that artists were moving. Thank you.
Ci sono ancora domande?
Are there other questions?
No? Bene, allora...
Well, then, thank you. We are on time. Let's end up this session. We will resume in the afternoon. Thank you.